and welcome to Breaking Barriers, the call to expand the talent pool. I'm Amy Spowert, President and CEO of the National Aviation Hall of Fame.
And I'm Greg Principato, President and CEO of the National Aeronautic Association. This is the 12th in a series of webinars being brought to you by a collaboration between the National Aviation Hall of Fame and the National Aeronautic Association. To learn more about our organizations, please visit our websites. We'd also like to thank the sponsors for today's webinar: Aerojet Rocketdyne, Boeing, Flight Safety International, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, Safran USA, and Raytheon Technologies.
Members of the Hall of Fame and the NAA received advance notice of today's webinar and were able to sign it up early for this limited opportunity. This will be the same for future webinars, so please consider becoming a member. As we go through this webinar, please feel free to send your questions and we will do our best to work them into the conversation. We have an amazing panel for you today, so with no further ado, I'd like to begin introducing them. First of all, in alphabetical order, we have Randy Babbitt. While flying as a commercial airline pilot for 25 years, Randy served in multiple roles at the Airline Pilots Association. In 1990, Randy was elected as president of ALPA, a position he held for 8 years. In 2009, Randy was confirmed as FAA administrator and followed that at Southwest Airlines, where he served as the VP of Labor Relations until he retired in 2016. Since then, Randy has worked as an airline and financial consultant. Dan Elwell is a 1983 graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and served during Operation Desert Storm as a combat pilot. After retiring from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel, Dan flew for American Airlines and served as managing director for international and government affairs. In 2008, Dan was named VP of Aerospace Industries Association and followed that by joining Airlines for America as senior vice president of safety, security, and operations. From 2015 to 2019, Dan served in FAA leadership, including acting administrator until 2019.
Trish Gilbert is an air traffic controller by trade with 21 years serving in that role, the Houston En route Center. For 12 years, Trish served as executive vice president of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, where she was a key player in several aviation issues in DC. Trish is currently serving on the International Federation of Air Traffic Controllers Association board as the executive vice president for the Americas region. For the last 20 months, Trish has been a member of the Women in Aviation Advisory Board. Becky Ludy is an associate professor at the Aviation Institute at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Dr. Ludy is a commercial pilot, a certified flight instructor, and a certified multi-engine instructor. Her research is centered on Aviation Sector safety policy, workforce development, pilot supply and outreach, and recruitment and retention of women in aviation. She is a member of the University Aviation Association Board of Trustees, among others, including the NAA board. And she was also a member, along with Trish and Amy, of the Women in Aviation Advisory Board. Over the last 2 decades, the aviation industry has been stagnant in attracting and retaining women. We know that while getting to this place was not intentional, the steps to address it must be. Today, we're going to explore the questions: how do we know this is a problem, and why is it important? Why does it matter? And most importantly, what can we do about it? So let's start with a poll question. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're putting the poll up now. Please feel free to put your answers up. In the November 2021 report, overall employment of airline and commercial pilots is expected to grow which percent from 2020 to 2030? 2, 7, 13, or 20? Now, while people are answering the poll question, Dan, because you were the last one to sign on, you get the first question. The FAA identifies over 53 aviation jobs in 8 career fields. We'll ask Stephanie to put up the answers as soon as we have them. In 8 career fields. Aviation is about much more. There's the answers. 20% gets the majority. The actual answer is 13%. Still a very, very large number, amounting to 14,500 openings, by the way. Dan, the FAA identifies over 53 aviation jobs in 8 career fields. I think Amy gave me this question because she's tired of saying those numbers. Aviation is about much more than what we see on a flight we take someplace, right? Please, Dan, talk about the depth and breadth of careers in aviation.
Thanks. Sorry, I did join a little bit late, but I'm happy to be here, Greg, and thanks for asking me to join. It would be hard, actually, I think, especially if you think of secondary and tertiary responsibilities in the aviation sector. But for those who are interested in the profession, it's basically broken up into sectors: operations, planning, manufacturing, design. In our world in DC, there's policy, there's legal. Just about any sort of normal role you would take in society writ large is applicable in one way or another in our space. So even the medical field, there are flight surgeons that specialize in the medical aspects of flying and what's required and to be a pilot and what disqualifies. And that's an exciting field because that's changing. Randy and I were talking about this recently, things that we never thought a pilot would be able to fly with, we currently can. So that's exciting. Obviously in the manufacturing side, it's multifaceted between experimental and light sport and general aviation, and then large commercial aircraft and all of the parts and maintenance and oversight and overhaul that goes along with those different sectors. So in the maintenance side, the engineering side, there's design and there's production. And that is where I think, along with the critical positions of pilots, I say critical meaning critical to the lead-in training and the lead-in that's required of being a pilot or being a controller, being an engineer. That's the critical areas that we're as an industry focused on, where the shortages are going to hit us the hardest. But obviously planning and dispatch is a whole other side of the commercial side of aviation. There's weather, there's international policy in the government side, regulatory policy, and legal policy in all aspects of flying. So it isn't just fly in and build an airplane, that's for sure.
Well, clearly it's a massive field with a lot of opportunity for a lot of different kinds of people. Hey, Randy, you've seen a lot during your time in aviation as a pilot, union leader, business person, and government official. Can you talk a little bit about the history of women in the aviation workforce? Where have we been?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you. Yeah, I've seen a lot of the transition over the years, and I should also, in the interest of full disclosure, I have two daughters. One of them is a pilot. I have 5 granddaughters. One of them is a pilot. She has a private license. And she's also working on getting her A&P mechanics license, which I found fascinating. But starting off, I instructed a lot when I was in college, and I probably sold 60 students over that time. About 10% of them were women. And I always reflected back and would tell people they were the best students I ever had. They came prepared, they studied, and so forth. And as I went on and in the airline world, there were, precious few female pilots back in those days. And I think a lot of it goes back in the culture. And I've read your report. It's an excellent report. And you hit right square on the nose with the culture issue. And part of that is that one. One of the things, and probably for a good reason, but a bad result later, go back 100 years, 1,000 years, whenever there was a conflict, men always manned the conflict. You didn't want to put women in harm's way. And so as we developed, so you had the Army Air Corps, later the Air Force, all of these, we didn't put women there. We didn't put them in combat. And so when they finished their flying for the military, they went on to the airlines. They became, the instructor pilots. They became the head of hiring, the chief pilot, the director of flight ops. And who did they hire? People like themselves, men. And so we've allowed this to develop over time, and it's really hard to break that pattern. But I equate a lot of this to, it's almost like a safety circle. If you have a problem, if there's something wrong, you need to find out what's wrong, what's broken, and you can't fix something you don't know what's broken. And so we have to acknowledge we've got a system that is broken, and it's just not paving the way simply enough and efficiently enough to bring women into the aviation sector. And I mean the entire aviation sector, whether it's executive level, flight ops, mechanics, avionics, everything, air traffic control. And some sectors have done much better as I migrated. Well, for example, at the FAA, I was always, well, I seemed like I was blessed with great people to work with. And probably half the executives I had at the FAA that I worked with were women, and they were terrific. And that paves the way for the next group. So once you get the culture changed, it'll take care of itself. But I think that's the biggest challenge for all of us, is to make that step, to make that move. And I'm tickled to death when I see that, you know, the chief pilot at Delta Airlines in Detroit is a woman. And you know, that's a great step. But all of these are great steps, but we just need to make sure that we keep following those steps.
Right on, right on. So Dan has set the stage. There's a lot of jobs in aviation, a lot of diverse jobs in aviation. And Randy, you shared about how, you know, women haven't necessarily had the same opportunities, but Trish, there are lots of women who have been very impactful in aviation despite any barriers that came their way. Women like Bessie Coleman and Colleen Barrett. Can you talk just briefly about the impact of women in aviation so far?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Greg and Amy, both for having me on this webinar. You know, trailblazers, pioneers, heroes, call them what you want, but, you know, a lot of amazing individuals, a lot of amazing women, you know, cleared pathways for those of us that came afterwards. And you named two of them, very obviously have done a tremendous amount of heroic type stuff to do that. I now think of people like Wally Funk is now being recognized. NAA gave her the Stenson Award just recently, and she's getting others. And that was long time overdue, as well as some of our, you know, astronauts that are setting the example for women of color that have not before seen astronauts, like Eileen Collins, who's not a woman of color, but then, you know, Mae Jemison, who's there that are doing amazing work. But I think when we discuss those pioneers or trailblazers, I think we look at the culture and the aviation careers and try and make sense of, do you really have to be a pioneer? Do you really have to have all of these challenges in front of you to simply be a part of this wonderful industry? And you shouldn't, and you don't. And that's what the work that the Women in Aviation Advisory Board is trying to accomplish, is to make it an industry that welcomes, recruits, retains, and advances women, as well as many other underrepresented groups, and keeps them, you know, in positions that can make a difference, like these pioneers have done.
I think those last two sets of comments, Trish and Randy, really set a lot of things up. Was somebody trying to say something before I ask the next question? No. So Becky, the data person, Dr. Data, we'll just call you Dr. Data. You got a new nickname. Great. You like to say the data tells the story. You always say that, and the data does not lie, or do not lie, I guess, plural or singular. Can you tell us what the historical data shows?
Sure. You know, I love data questions, so happy to do that. So again, thank you both for having me on, and of course for highlighting the report and the topic. And Greg, the professor in me is going to tell you, I love that you start with a quiz question right out of the gate. So that just makes my heart happy. But yes,
we're here to make you happy.
Love it. Looking at the historical data, as we know, women are underrepresented in aviation. They make up less than 20% of most of the occupation areas. But the real key is you look at the historical trend. And what you'll see, as Randy noted earlier, precious few in the early days. So for example, if you look at the FAA Civil Airmen statistics all the way back to 1960, we had 25 female ATPs. So we now have over 7,500. So that's good, right? The numbers are going the right direction. The problem is, as a percent of the total, the representation of women has really been stagnant. So I call it more of a flatline effect. So for example, if you look at commercial pilots over the last 60 years, the percentage of female commercial pilots has increased about 1% a decade. And in maintenance, it's less than half of that. So today we're at 5% airline pilots that are women and only 3% of maintenance technicians that are women. So Randy, I'm glad that your granddaughter's going to add to that total. I'm really, really glad to hear that. So that's part of it. The other quick mention I want to say though, is there's also what the data doesn't tell, the story that you don't hear, because we don't even do a good job of measuring it. And that's the intersectionality that Trish was mentioning as well. You know, Trish, Amy, and I are kind of familiar with the experience of being the only in the room. I'm not familiar with the experience of being the double only, being a woman and a woman of color. And we know that from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that pilots are 94% white, but we really don't even break down the data to break down gender by race, ethnicity. So we don't have good data on that intersectionality. So that's a little bit about what it tells historically, and also my call to say that we need to do a better job of measuring. There are recommendations for that, of course, in the report. And that will give us a better indication of trends in a wider variety of areas.
Nicely done, Becky, as usual. 2 years ago, Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao appointed 30 aviation leaders to an advisory board to address the lack of opportunities for women in the industry. The board's charge was to examine the scarcity of females entering aviation and recommend ways to attract, retain, and advance more women within the field. This past March, the Women in Aviation Advisory Board submitted our report, which contained 55 recommendations to the United States Congress. Dan, you were deputy FAA administrator when the board was put together. Can you talk about the discussions inside the FAA and the DOT about the need for this work and the changes that was hopeful to, or what the hoped outcome would be?
Well, thanks for that, Amy. You know, the deliberations about the Women in Aviation Advisory Board were, some of them are statutory because they come from a congressional directive, and they have certain, you know, sort of rules and policies that go along with those on how they're nominated and how the decisions are made. And that's just all pro forma stuff. But the real discussion was about, you know, trying to make the board really effective, you know, and bring about the change that Becky was just talking about, which is how do we get from 5 to something even remotely approximating the distribution of women in the population. So it is abysmal, and it has been. And so the whole idea was to set up a program that explored much the same as we're doing, and we have done for now probably over a decade, to increase STEM involvement, right? Just adding the impetus of focusing, getting women involved more in STEM. I mean, the stat that Becky said about on the engineering side or on the maintenance side is you know, some of it obviously is cultural, but increasingly women are finding out more and more that this is a profession, and this is an area that's pretty cool. So first and foremost, we wanted to get the women in aviation, and there are a lot of them. I know we've all been following Melissa Sabatini's, I guess it's a weekly thing she does on LinkedIn with women. I think you've all been at her side on highlighted you at one point or another. So we wanted to make sure we got the right applicants. I think we did. We spent a good deal of time talking about the representation of the population of women in aviation writ large on the board, so that we could use their expertise. And I mean, for me personally, there's a couple of folks that jumped out on the application list that were like must-haves. And I did have the ability to talk to the secretary, because she was hands-on on selecting this board, and I was able to talk to her and say, you know, we got to have Trish and we got to have Amy, you know. But the part I'm proudest about, and having only sat in on one or two of your meetings because you wouldn't let me. I kept asking and you said, no, I couldn't. This is women only. No, that did not happen. But I would love to hear your all's. I said I think Heather Wilson would make a phenomenal chair, and she was a classmate back at the zoo, the academy back in the day. So I made that sort of my my contribution is to convince her, and she didn't take any convincing at all. She said, "Of course you do it," and you know, and I think from what I saw, she did a really good job.
She was amazing, wouldn't you say, Becky and Trish?
Yeah, I'm just nodding away. Absolutely. So thank you for that, because she really was incredible and really helped steer the ship and keep us on the magenta line, so to speak.
Really sort of along those. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to see if Trish wanted to say anything about Heather's leadership as well, or acknowledge what Dan said. I didn't want to ask you directly, Dan. Sorry, I'm off script now. I didn't want to ask you directly how people were chosen for the board, but it is, I think, fascinating, and it's really cool to have some of that insight, because we're always like, I for one was like, how lucky am I? Like I felt so blessed, and it was probably, if you look at my social media, it was probably one of the high points of my professional career, without a doubt. The day that report was submitted to Congress, I'm not gonna lie, I cried a little. So it was a lot. It was really hard, but it was so worth it. Trish, I'm sorry, did you want to?
Well, let me just say one thing about that, so that you don't think it was real super arbitrary. We actually had a numerical weighting system and applied numericals to the tenets that we wanted the board to maintain or to contain, and so the highest point, totals is who basically who got on the board, and you all,
Data.
Well, Dan, I also believe, I think it was put out by the secretary herself that there was going to be so many on the board, and then there was just so much interest and so many qualified people that the actual board became 30, I think, instead of 20 or something like that.
That was another thing. I didn't want to throw that in, but we fought to make it bigger because of how many great applicants we had.
So 30.
Go ahead, Trish. 30
individuals, yes. To go back to the question that Amy about Heather and her leadership, yes, it is no matter who you have, either virtually or in person, trying to steer 30 people on deadline, on topic, and keep everybody focused. She did an amazing job. Very, very, great, very great at the job. Scared me a little bit a couple of times, because when she made a decision, she was right on it, and we all got in line and walked right behind her and made it happen.
And I do have this, and I've been like, I know a couple of my fellow board members have theirs, like I know Dana Donati does as well, has it. I had it professionally framed, and it's in my office. So anyway, I'm sorry, Greg.
Yeah, no, this is all great, having been, involved in something like this in the past, and actually with Randy. But I mean, finding out how people are selected, there are so many, wonderful folks who were selected and who were not selected. And I think I'd heard at one point there were 200 people who had expressed interest in it or something like that. You're nodding, and maybe even more than that, probably thought they should have been, named. And so, I mean, it was, clearly a blue ribbon commission. And really getting to sort of add on to the question about Heather's leadership, this really is a question for Trish and for Becky and for Amy, really. Talk about the challenges of working on all this through a worldwide pandemic. You took 2 years. You never got together, all 30 of you, in one place. Randy, I know you've been on these commissions. I think, Dan, you have. I ran one, was on one. I don't know how you all did it. Talk about how you did it through all that. Did it limit what you were able to do? Did it affect the findings? Or are there things you wish you could have spent more time on? Maybe you just weren't able to because you couldn't get together. Tell me about that. We'll start with Trish, and then I'd love to hear Becky and Amy weigh in on that too.
Thanks, Greg. Initially I thought it would significantly impact our work, but being the great group that it was, we figured out a way to get the work done, and we got very creative. We probably made ourselves concentrate and focus on the work even more so, to the tune of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of virtual meetings, databases, and talk about the selection of the individuals on the board. Most didn't know each other. It wasn't a typical 30 people that are inside the Beltway. It was all over the country from all different backgrounds. So getting to know each other was important, and you couldn't do that the same way virtually that you could in person, but we got there. And I think many of the board members will be lifelong friends. But in addition to that, we took the time to reach out to other entities that weren't on the board. We spent time with the Flight Attendants Union. Sarah Nelson joined us for a call with Catherine Jackson from the Dispatchers Federation and others. Oh, that's the one time we did get, that was one of our drafting sessions at Southwest Airlines. Dan's holding up a picture. That's about, I think, right at half of us were able to get to Dallas and do that. And that was really set to draft and prioritize and then make a decision on some of the recommendations. As you well know, there were 55 in the report. Really, there could have been hundreds and hundreds of recommendations in the report. So we had to take, the lead from Heather and be really uber focused and make sure that we were concise in what we needed in the report to really affect change. But that goes back to the pandemic. I think Heather's leadership was key, the way she structured the committee into 4 different subcommittees, Becky leading one, Amy leading another, and then 2 others in place to kind of split the work up and then figure out at what point did it make sense to break down the barriers that or the silos of those committees, not that they were real big or significant, but they did exist a little bit and now come together as a committee as a whole and then get the report done. That was all Heather, along with the committee chairs to make that work. And I thought, looking back, I think that things were done very well. And it didn't seem like we'd ever get here, almost 2 years doing the work. But I think if you look at what we produced, it was pretty fast, actually, in light of everything else that everybody had going on, which everybody has their day jobs, which keep them very busy. To spend the time on this was with no staff to get it done the way we were able to do.
Oh, the humility of Trish Gilbert. And she's leaving out the fact that she and Lauren Hartline lost like a year of sleep writing the thing. We all did the research and data gathering, and Trish and Lauren put it together like amazing, masterful people. Becky, did you want to add anything? I think Trish hit everything.
I think she hit it all. Like she said, it was a bit of a challenging work environment, but everybody is just so passionate about this topic that we just, got together and got the job done. So no, I think she covered it very well. Thanks.
Hey, Randy, I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the elephants in the room. Let's be honest about this. So whenever Becky or Trish or Amy or anybody on the committee puts something in social media, you look at the comments, and it seems like way more than you'd like to see of the comments are from men who have snarky things to say at best. Why? Talk a little bit about why it's important for us, for men to support this report, to support these recommendations. How do we share that this isn't about taking something from them, but it's about adding, it's about making the industry more talented, ensuring that there's enough skilled people to work in a growing industry. Can you talk about that? I think that's an elephant in the room that we need to talk about.
Sure. I think you're right on. The report itself, you sort of wish this would be required reading for everybody in the airline world or anybody in aviation, whether you're male or female. But it really is. I mean, we talked earlier. It is a cultural problem. It has become ingrained. But the good news is we're starting to see it daily, and I think that's important. I think one of the things, I mentioned earlier, I read the whole report, and there's a chart in that report that shows the compounding at the different ages. And I mean, having 2 daughters, when I can remember when, my oldest was like, 10 or 11 years old, and she said, she had decided she wanted to be a nurse. And I said, well, why don't you just be a doctor? That's the chart. So why don't you just be a doctor? Oh, no, that's for men. No, it's not for men. Anybody can be a doctor. And the good news is her oldest daughter is now in medical school, becoming a doctor. So, but it's that onset early on, the guidance, and people just, I think, subconsciously put up social barriers in their conversations that, well, this is a male occupation, or this. No, they're not. These are all, aviation is important. I mean, so much of our goods, our services, our travel, everything we do has some point going to touch aviation. And so I think it's really important to begin to cure this at the base level, which is getting everybody to understand what has been allowed to develop over time are these artificial barriers that get in the way. And you can't fix that unless you understand it. And I think one of the challenges is going to be making sure that everybody understands what needs to come. Because there's another chart in there, and I'm sure that Amy will show that too. But it shows you that the progress that's being made and the goals that have to be accomplished. And people should understand that. And I think the challenge for all of us is to make sure that folks in a variety of positions, whether you're leading a union, whether you're leading an FAA, whether you're in collective bargaining, it doesn't matter. All of us have to understand that we've got to do a better job of keeping these pathways open. And as you mentioned at the start, this isn't taking a job away from somebody. We have a shortage of pilots. We don't have an abundance of pilots. And I'm always I was appreciative. I'm glad to see that Heather Wilson getting the coverage here. I heard her speak when she was Secretary of the Air Force, and I was fascinated. She introduced a number of things different in the Air Force, the training expedited, putting a whole lot more energy and emphasis on the quality of the training rather than the quantity of the training. Just flat number of more flight hours. That didn't appeal to her. Quality trained flight hours and introducing things like virtual reality to training. Those are huge steps, but she should be proud of what was accomplished with all of that. But again, back to the core question, we've got to make sure this filters into the system and absorbed and accepted to move forward.
Yeah, I'm convinced that Amy, just to go off script, just for a
Yes.
second, if I could, just one little soapbox moment, that it's going to take people like who look like Randy and Dan and me getting behind this and talking about it for something to happen. I'm really convinced of that. And so I think, Randy, you make a lot of good points. I see Dan, nodding as well.
Well, I have 5 granddaughters and 2 daughters, so
I've only got sons. It's critically important.
Yeah, and it's great. It's great to hear this acknowledgement and the need for greater awareness. But Dan, is industry ready to change? Is industry, big industry, is the government and industry ready for this? What are your thoughts? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I think they are. Obviously, I mentioned it earlier, there's biases on male-female biases in certain professions. And still, as Greg mentioned on LinkedIn, there's still, you see vestiges of it. But necessity is the mother of invention. It's also the mother of overcoming biases in cultural things, because right now, the pilot shortage is real. I was pretty early in the predicting of this and what to do about it. And one of the things is to tap into this wonderful half of our population, right? Who can do this profession as well as men. And I sit on the board of Alaska Airlines, and I can tell you that it is a board level discussion about pilot availability. And every airline in the business today is plumbing into or piping into every college, especially, of course, the aeronautical certification type colleges, and trying to develop pipelines that start young and get folks involved. But that absolutely includes women. I think the industry, I don't know what Randy thinks and Trish, but we're past a woman in the cockpit. I mean, it seems like a lot of flights. I'm very happy to see women in the cockpit, but but no, I don't think there's any bias in the business right now that's strong enough to keep women who want to be pilots from becoming pilots. We have other barriers, but they're gender neutral. It's like the cost, right? It's getting 1,500 hours to get into a regional carrier or big metal, as we call it. And Randy just touched on one of the ways that we can, I think, mitigate that hurdle.
I would add one item here, getting the awareness. Any of the women in this webinar, you make such, I mean, you've got such background, you're wonderful speakers, and getting you in places where you can convey that message is important. I was tickled to death. Allison McKay is the president of Women in Aviation, and I invited her, and she accepted to join the National Area Capital Boy Scouts. She's on the executive board now, and I told her our goal, by the way, is to go from STEM to STEAM. We want an A in there for aviation. So plenty of programs we have STEM. We want STEAM. So she's going to help champion that. But I mean, you know, getting people in those places where they can discuss and make those changes is really important. And I think that dialogue has to expand.
Yeah, I think we agree with that a lot. So Becky, data, tell us what's going to happen if we don't change. Where's the industry headed if the barriers that are in place aren't addressed? And
Yeah, well, yeah, you know, I'll throw some statistics in here because that's, you know, how I roll for all my answers I'm going to give you. But let me start with this. So we talk a lot in the report about the benefits of having diversity of thought in the industry. And that includes things like enhanced innovation, profitability, increased safety. So if we don't change and we don't continue to bring broader representation of thought, we'll see that impact those areas. And the other really big area we've already touched on with Randy and Dan, and that's really the workforce issue. I mean, we clearly have a staffing issue. It's all over the news. We've talked about pilots, but especially maintenance technicians. This is a real talent threat to the industry, the shortage and the lack of supply of maintenance technicians. And everything really from the ramp to the flight deck, you know, is a topic of staffing right now. So it's a lot of areas. This is an obvious untapped market that we've already talked about, but I also want to throw in another point to that. And that is that, yes, the recruitment is essential. And I love that we're talking about youth outreach. And of course, we have several recommendations about that in the report. But another piece of that is retention. So once we get them hooked into the industry, we've got to at least keep the women that have come to aviation, that we've invested in, that they've invested in their career. And we know from a survey of women in aviation that 38% of the women surveyed said they have considered leaving the industry. That's a number that should get our attention. And the top two reasons were number one, family work-life balance, and number two, negative workplace culture. Primarily bias, discrimination, harassment. So, you know, I agree with 100% with the recruitment. We spend a big piece of time in the report on recruitment, but I would also point out that retention is also going to be critical in terms of, you know, looking at the future of the industry and what will happen in terms of change of not having that broader representation. So we've got to recruit, but we've also got to focus on those key barriers and make sure that we're keeping the women that we have in the industry.
Mhm.
so
Well,
just to clarify, Becky, is there a point at which we know the airline industry or aviation industry in general is gonna, like, we're gonna really, I mean, we see some of it now, and we can say that it's because of the pandemic, but are we getting to is there gonna be a point where we're at critical mass and like we're in trouble?
I think we're looking at that, you know, we're having conversations now industry-wide on staffing. You know, like I said, particularly maintenance is one that I think is kind of the unsung area a lot of times. That's really, really, really critical. And you look at the ATEC report on more data, and of course it's all in our report as well. But yeah, I think we're already having those conversations. And as I said, if you've got half of the workforce that's women, but only 3% maintenance technicians, that's an obvious place to start solving the problem, you know, is to do more recruitment and retention of getting women into to solve that issue.
Yeah, and Amy, to add to that, if make sure I'm not on mute. Before the pandemic, Kate Lang, who worked at the FAA, I believe she's retired now, testified before Congress about maintenance technicians and the critical shortage of that workforce and how it was going to impact aviation. And that was probably a good year before, if not longer, before the pandemic hit. So this is something that the industry has been looking at for a while. Hopefully now the momentum continues and this report will help build a better foundation for us to all stand on and make real change occur. I do want to really quickly, I know this goes off script. Becky mentioned safety. I want to just talk a little bit about, at least from my perspective, and I think most, the industry safety is number one priority. We're all, and I don't know if the whole audience is part of a workforce that knows and understands what a safety culture is or a just culture. But it's not only about having the appropriate staffing and the diversity of thought and talent in your deeper talent pool and bringing them in, retaining them, but it's creating an environment where they can feel comfortable in expressing their true selves and bringing ideas forward, in reporting things that aren't maybe going exactly as they should, in an effort to correct those safety concerns before they become catastrophic, which is what a safety culture is. But if you have a work environment where they're not welcome or don't feel like they're comfortable enough to raise their hand and raise their voice in areas that are important, then you won't reach that true safety culture that all of us are looking for. So I do believe that an inclusive culture, or a culture where there is unfortunately some bias and discrimination that still occurs, is never going to get us to the level that we need to around safety. We can always, we're the safest in the world, we're the most complex in the world, but there's more that we all can do to hold each other accountable and to break down those barriers and make sure that we not only bring those women in and those other underrepresented groups, but make it a place where they really want to thrive and they can thrive and they feel welcome. They're not just trying to fit in and find a place, and they're not just trailblazers like those that come before us. They're actually part of the fabric of aviation.
So
that
great.
really helps. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm gonna skip the poll question because Trish is on a roll, and I don't want to lose that momentum. So in light of everything you just said, Trish, what is the number one recommendation to address, in your opinion, to address the cultural issues? Because safety is key, right? Safety is paramount. So in your opinion, what is it that needs to come number one out of the recommendations?
Sure. Safety, number one. Profitability, innovation, all of it, sustainability, all of it very important. 55 recommendations. How do you pick one? But what you can do is look at recommendation 14, which is in law, establish a permanent committee that is there to focus on this. They're actually appointed outside of the FAA at a government-wide level. We provided the language in the report. That way they have the staff, the resources, the focus to continue what we've started and take the great work of so many entities, from government to industry to nonprofits, and we move that ball forward and we continue. Everybody's got a million things that they're trying to juggle in, no matter where you come from, what organization or company. But if you can put this group in place, then you can see us move forward and finally and eventually see real change in those numbers that Becky talked about earlier. So that would be my number one, is saying you can't expect that we're going to write a report, pass it over to the FAA, over to Congress, over to industry, and they're all just going to do what they need to do. I mean, there's been reports before us on a variety of other things, and if you don't have an entity leading that effort and holding industry accountable and government accountable, then it's not going to happen, I don't believe. I think it will just become another report that's really beautiful. If I do say so myself, and for all 29 of us, it is beautiful. But this is where the real work begins, is making sure those recommendations get implemented. And that committee is going to be key to that.
Yeah, if I could follow up on that, I mean, the conversation that we've had the last 5 or 10 minutes, I think really tees up the really hard part. What do we do? And the retention issue is just stark to me, and how difficult it is. And you've all talked about women reporting leaving aviation because of the workplace culture they find unwelcoming. They've experienced harassment. Becky, can you talk about some of the recommendations to handle this, to do something about this? And how do those facing those kind of challenges in the industry who otherwise want to stay in the industry, but feel pulled to leave it because of that? How do those folks report the problems in such a way that leads to action and also protects their jobs?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I do think this is probably the most serious and highest priority issue that we have. And I'm going to share with you one of the stats from the report that I think really drives this point home. And that was that 71% of women in aviation surveyed said they have experienced sexual harassment in the aviation workplace. And that's a current number, and that's one statistic, but we cited multiple studies that all clearly show that harassment, bias, discrimination is a deterrent to our ability to recruit, retain, and advance women in our field. So that begs the question of what do we do and how do we address it? So we have a whole series of recommendations in the report. And one of the key areas is reporting and the response. So one thing is we know that women don't feel comfortable or safe reporting. So even those numbers I cited you, we know that we get under-reporting of this issue from women in the workplace because they fear retaliation and just because they're not comfortable bringing that information forward within the workplace. So we need to establish, as Trish was talking about, the just culture where reporting becomes a safe space for women and they know there's going to be a response to it. So there has to be accountability and there has to be zero tolerance policies towards these types of actions. As an example, Boeing, in their diversity report that they put out, they actually are pretty transparent about this, and they put out in their annual report that's on their website the number of employees that they fired or taken action against for violation of these kinds of policies. So we need to be zero tolerance, towards these issues, and those are some of the recommendations. Another one that's in there I think is important in establishing that culture that Trish just described so well, and that is including education, awareness, conversations of this within SMS. So one of our recommendations is this should be a required component of safety management systems. And we know that SMS is becoming required throughout the industry. So that will make sure that this is built into the cultures of the industry. So there's others that we could talk about, but I think so those are some of the key areas to try to start driving that change.
Before the next question that I wanted to ask, do Trish or Amy have anything they want to add to that?
Becky, she's perfection in every way.
Okay, there, Dr. Data hits every point. So Randy, so we're talking about employees, right? I mean, every employee needs to be protected. You as well as Trish, been labor leader, and so talk about the role of collective bargaining groups in affecting this cultural change we need.
It's a tough one. The union in some regards, if you're in a union, you're a leader in a union, and you've got an obligation just like a corporate side. I mean, if you think about it, bargaining, when you have collective bargaining, that's the alternative to taking all the shareholders and putting them on one side of the stadium and all the employees on the other side of the stadium and see if you can work out a deal, which we all know is impossible. So they pick people, called management, and the union picks people, called their leadership, and you work things out. With that comes there's some consequences of duty of fair representation. So you have to be fair to everybody. And I think the unions are probably going to be as challenged as corporations to make progress. I was always proud of ALPA. We had a number of women representatives, some terrific ones. We testified in Congress. There was a woman, Mary Carolyn Minton from ComAir. She had been a research chemist. I think she had a doctorate in chemistry, but she decided she liked flying airplanes better. And she was awesome. I mean, she led her pilot group. That make those kind of moves, everybody gets to see it, and they see. Trish is a wonderful example. I mean, I had the pleasure of working with both Paul and Trish for a number of years, and the progress that was made under their leadership. But clearly, they had all the respect of their members, and they respected their members, and both of those things go hand in hand. And so a lot was accomplished. I don't think you're going to achieve more, but what the union can do, and I'm going to take it out of the collective bargaining arena because of the constraints of duty of fair representation, and you can't say, well, we have to hire more, this or that. No, you sued immediately if you did. But what you can do, there's committees, and I know that NATCA has one, ALPA certainly has one on every property, which is a professional standards group. And this allows you to put your hand up and say, look, I just flew with somebody and they need somebody to talk to them, and this is a peer conversation. You take folks, you educate them to learn how to deal with these different situations, which is sexual harassment. You making remarks that were disingenuous, or what was the issue? But it's a whole different deal when you get called into the chief pilot's office versus when you get called in by your union and sit down with a couple of other pilots and said, hey, this doesn't fly, pal. You can't, this behavior is not acceptable, and you're going to have to make some changes. And I think that is a huge place where the unions, no matter what, we're talking aviation, but every union, and I'm sure, and Trish can echo in here, professional standards exist, I'm almost certain, within the air traffic controller industry or ranks. So that's where I think you're going to make your biggest progress, is getting the unions more involved and getting programs that allow people to put their hand up and explain they had a problem, and get the people involved some help, some counseling, and educate them a little better. And say, to be in this workplace, this is what we do, and you're not doing it, and you got to change.
Amy, you're on mute. I think.
I'm supposed to be a professional. Trish, I was going to throw a question to you, but I saw Dan nodding a lot. So I was wondering, maybe you'd like to comment on what Randy said, Dan, and then I'll go to Trish, or. Oh, you're on mute. You're a professional too.
Yeah, I have a dog that's very, very talkative. So I'm.
This wouldn't be the first time a dog joined one of our webinars, Randy, or Dan, so it's okay.
Yeah. No, Wendell had international notoriety during the CART Zooms during the pandemic. Anyway, no, it's just nodding and just affirmation of everything that Randy was saying, having been, in a pilot union and flying for an airline, and then having on management side, and nodding in affirmation to how difficult it can be. But if you pick the right people and you sit down, you'll always hammer it out.
Are unions ready for that, Dan?
I'm sorry?
Are they ready for that? Are they ready to make change and address these things, do you think?
I'm actually surprised that they're not, that it isn't codified more. It certainly wasn't when I was flying, but I would be surprised if in the time since I was flying regularly as a union pilot that there isn't more being done.
Sure. Trish, I'm ready. I'm ready for your thoughts. I'm sure you've got stuff to say. I'm excited to hear it. Go, Trish, go.
So, just like you want that safe space in your work environment, you also need to feel safe in your union. You need to feel welcome and part of their priority, their goals. So it is important, as Randy mentioned, the professional standards. NACA did create also a code of conduct. We subscribe to it. If you attend a training event or any kind of program that NACA puts on and you don't meet those expectations as laid out in that code of conduct, the situation can be reported, investigated. You could be sent home and never to return to another event or training. Or in one case, unfortunately, because the situation was pretty egregious, we permanently removed an individual from ever being a union representative again. And that is the standing up and leading from the front as unions. You hold your own association just as accountable as you would your employer. The second piece to that was, the negotiating table. It is difficult. It's difficult on prioritizing because everything you get at the negotiation table, I promise you, you gave something else up. So it is kind of a balance and a dance a little bit. I will tell you though, NACA did in our collective bargaining proposal before we were able to secure into law 12 weeks of paid parental leave, which I'm sure is one of the subjects we're going to talk about here really quickly, in law for men and women that for the birth or adoption of a child became law. We were trying to bargain it, obviously, and NACA did propose that we couldn't get it across the table because it did have a dollar associated with it, a big dollar number. But we did at least agree in the very first iteration to look at the feasibility of a program and what would that look? Could we get creative? What came out of that first effort was the ability to advance women that were pregnant that needed to not be in the work environment because something occurred on their pregnancy, advance them sick leave and donate sick leave to them. That was not something that was available before we came across it doing that work. And then again, eventually, as I mentioned, we were able to work into law the 12 weeks of paid parental leave. So there are things that can be done to retain women, which again, I know we're going to get into the flexibility of family-friendly policies and what that kind of environment that creates for a workforce.
So, Trish, I think your comment, we only got about 5 minutes left, unfortunately. I think we could go, we'll go a little over, but, we can go on probably for another hour or two, I think, pretty easily on all this. So I want to ask a question, sort of the preamble will be, Trish, to let you talk a little bit about amplifying what you just said about the family-friendly policies and so forth. And then for everyone, so if you could talk about some of the policy recommendations, Trish, a little bit, and then if everyone can chime in after that, and what it will take to really keep the pressure up on FAA, on governmental entities, industry bargaining groups, because there's a role for everybody, right? So Trish, if you can talk a bit about those policies and other changes that need to change, and then if we could have just a general discussion among everyone about what it'll take to keep the pressure on to make that change.
Well, I think the momentum is significant enough for organizations, companies, and government to figure out how they're going to gain that competitive edge. And having that competitive edge means they're going to have to figure out how do they make the work environment more desirable to the rest of the talent pool, and how do they, once they get them in, how do they retain them? Because it's costing them an awful lot now, not having sufficient staffing to keep the industry moving. And then it will start to affect safety. And then that's a situation we don't want to find ourselves in. In the 55 recommendations, we have some that are focused to DOT, some to FAA, quite a few to FAA, many to industry itself, and several to members of Congress or to Congress itself, and that would need action or support or legislation. But again, as I mentioned earlier, just writing the report and writing the recommendations isn't enough. We are trying to we are meeting with legislators. Unfortunately, not a lot of them have come out of, the working from home scenario. So we're meeting some virtual, a lot with staff. I would have liked to have seen, as we're setting up meetings on the Hill, more congressmen and women wanting to meet with us. I think we'll get there, but we're not quite there yet. We are meeting with a lot of a staff, which is fine. They work very, very hard. But I think at some point we do need to meet with more legislators, because the FAA bill, FAA reauthorization bill for 2023 is being drafted as we speak. Might not be pen to paper quite yet, but certainly being discussed. I think there's a lot of these recommendations will be right to go in that piece of legislation, and we need to make sure that that happens. So continued leadership commitment, not just I read the report, I agree with the report, really a commitment on leadership to see real change, which means look at their policies, reflect on their own organization, hold their leadership accountable if they're not leadership, make sure that they use their roles to promote this work and promote the recommendations and get them in place. Otherwise, I think we're going to move backwards. Unfortunately, I think we'll move backwards quicker than any of us would like to see.
That is unfortunate. Let's try to find a more a happier note to end on. I'll ask a lightning round question. I know Amy's got a lightning round question, and then we'll wrap up. So I'll go the order we introduced you in: Randy, Dan, Trish, and then Becky. First, Randy. Same question for all of you. What's it going to take to keep the pressure on governmental entities, industry, labor, other kind of groups to make change? What are the kind of things that have to happen? Maybe 30 seconds each to keep the pressure on.
Well, I think having things just like you're doing right now is important. Letting people understand. A lot of people don't appreciate there is a problem. When only less than 3% of all the mechanics in this country are women, we got a problem, Houston. We have a problem, and we've got to find. And I think the communication is the solution to that problem, and communicating, the issues, the statistics, and the pathways to fix it. And I think if we do that, it'll pick up its own steam and get, we've made a lot of progress in a lot of areas. When you think of, some of the injustices that have gone on in the past and the recognition they get today, and we come up with fixes. And I think that's what we're going to have to do, is continue to educate, continue to communicate, and continue to put these issues in front of people where it matters.
Dan?
Well, I think key would be, flood the zone. If you're successful in just getting women in the profession, when it's representative, it's hard for there to be bias. I mean, small minorities tend to get the brunt of bias and harassment-like treatment. I think so. A two-prong approach. The Women in Aviation Advisory Board report, or some small subset of the Women in Aviation Advisory Board could be an ad hoc group that revisits certain questions periodically. I know that's one of the recommendations, is an annual thing, but specifically this issue to have a metric. Becky, there you go. Data to track. But I think the positive solution is, let's just get all these recommendations in play that can get a lot more women in the space, because that's how you, I think, kill the negative side of things, but just having more people doing it, more women in it.
Trish?
Randy and Dan both very, very well said. The report certainly doesn't come with all the solutions. It's not an exhaustive, this is your, everything that's going to fix it. It really is designed for a shared responsibility for all of us to work together to make this happen. But I think, Dan said it, one of the recommendations is an annual summit. There's a lot of organizations doing things right, and we need to recognize and promote those things. And I think the more you promote that, the more others will join in and see the value. One, recognize that there's an issue, and two, see the value in promoting that positive work environment and those policies that are affecting real change. So I like that positive, success stories kind of way forward. And I think that will help us get to where we need to be.
Becky?
Yeah, so how do we keep the pressure on, and how do we make the change? I think for me, the answer is threefold. I'm going to lead with data. So I think we have to keep measuring and make sure that we're following the trends, and we know that the investments that we make in this area work or don't. I think that's essential. I think number two, the answer is, what can we do? Somebody just posted in the chat, what can I do to help push the recommendations? And my answer to that is something. For everyone out there, there is something in this report. So find the one recommendation that speaks to you, whether for me, in a lot of ways, it's the inappropriate or abusive actions in medical exams, and some others that I think are really important to address. So find the one that speaks to you, and help push that through and bring awareness to that issue. And then third and final, ultimately, the market's going to dictate this. So, we need staffing, and we need workforce supply in the industry. And as we said in our vision statement, the whole purpose here is to recruit and retain the best available talent for aviation. So I think ultimately, that's the need, and that's why the recommendations will get implemented. Hopefully.
Right on. I'm not going to ask a lightning round because I don't know how we could possibly top what everybody said. But in regards to what Trish said, I just have to say, on LinkedIn and social media, there's a lot of people who like to celebrate female pilots, female Marines, female astronauts, female this, female that. Those people are just pilots, Marines, and astronauts. We shouldn't be celebrating an all female this or all female that. I like the success stories, like Boom Supersonic, for example, is hiring lots of females, and they're not. I said to Blake Scholl, I'm like, hey, great job hiring lots of females. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about, because they're just hiring the best people for the job. Let's just hire the best people for the job, So anyway, that's a very long way of saying, I'm sorry I went off script again, sorry. But thank you all so much for being here. We're really grateful for this. We're really, really grateful for our sponsors. But yeah, Randy, Dan, Trish, and Becky, thank you so much. And thank you again to Aerojet Rocketdyne, Boeing, Flight Safety International, NADCA, Safran USA, and Raytheon for supporting us. And if you're not a member, please consider joining the NAA or the National Aviation Hall of Fame today. Fortunately, we have reciprocal membership. So if you join one, you join the other. So Greg?
I can't top that, Amy. Thank you all very much for being with us. And just remember, I think what Becky said might be the line of the day. We all have a role to play. There's something we can all do something that should speak to all of us. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.